Welcome back to Revise and Resubmit, and welcome to another weekend book review. I'm Pavlov.
And I'm Nikita.
We've noticed a lot of you are tuning in, which is amazing, but I haven't quite hit that subscribe button yet.
Yeah, and that little button, honestly, it's so small, but it makes such a huge difference in helping us reach more people with these important discussions.
Right. It's true. Like the algorithms, those mysterious forces that decide what we all see and hear, they pay a lot of attention to subscriber numbers.
Yeah, think of it like the subscribing. It's like casting a vote for quality content, So these insightful research discussions don't just get lost in the sea of all the information out there.
More subscribers equals more visibility. Right. And that means more resources for us to make even deeper dives for you.
Yeah.
Maybe bring in experts for interviews, even do some live Q&A sessions where you can jump in.
Yeah, exactly. It's all about building a community around research,
Yeah.
where curiosity thrives and knowledge is like shared and debated.
Okay, so we all eat right. We have to. But have you ever stopped to think about all the stuff that goes into it? Like even something as simple as a bowl of cereal.
I think a lot of people would be really surprised if they really took a minute to think about it. I mean, there's so much involved.
Yeah.
Everything from the farms to the environment to our bodies to, society. We're talking about agronomy, ecology, biology, geography, sociology, anthropology, psychology, even politics and history.
It's a lot.
Yeah.
And today we're going to really dive deep into the whole global food system, try to figure out how everything's connected. And, maybe question some of the stuff we think we know about food, from ancient diets to, how our food gets to us today. One thing that's kind of crazy is that we can produce more food than ever before, but there's still tons of people who don't have enough to eat.
Yeah, that's one of the big paradoxes of our modern food system. We've got overproduction and undersupply happening at the same time. It's a really complex situation.
Okay, so let's start with something that might surprise you, especially if you've ever thought about, eating like our ancestors. The paleo diet. It turns out it's not as simple as it sounds.
Yeah, the paleo diet, it's become pretty popular. But to really understand it, I think we need to look at, how people ate in the past. And anthropologist Alyssa Crittenden has done some really interesting research on this. She lived with the Hadza people of Tanzania, and they're modern-day foragers.
Yeah, the Hadza. And what's cool is that Crittenden's research shows that they don't have a strict diet. They eat what's available. It changes throughout the year. And get this, she was told that they never eat fish. But then she saw them eating fish.
Right, so much for those fixed paleo rules. It shows just how adaptable humans can be and how much our diet is influenced by the environment.
And if you think about it, trying to follow a real paleo diet today would be really hard. I mean, even if you could find all those wild foods, they probably taste awful. Plus, imagine trying to gather enough berries or nuts to make a meal. You'd be out there all day.
Absolutely. And there's another thing to consider. Anthropologist Christina Warner points out that there wasn't just one paleo diet. There were all kinds of variations depending on where and when people lived.
Makes sense, right? Foragers in a tropical forest are going to eat different stuff than people living on the coast or in the Arctic.
Exactly. There were even immediate return foragers. They ate whatever they found right away. So this idea of a single perfect paleo diet for everyone, it's just not accurate.
So the paleo diet, as we often think of it, is kind of a myth. But looking at groups like the Hadza can teach us some things, especially about sustainability.
Yeah, and one of the big takeaways is how different their lifestyle is from, the mindset in a lot of industrialized societies.
Yeah.
The Hadza really get how everything in their environment is connected.
Right, they have a totally different approach to nature. We often think of it as something separate, something we could just take from.
It's really about, this idea of resource extraction and competition, which is pretty different from the Hadza. They share everything. And there's no real competition, not within their communities and not with nature.
It's a different way of seeing the world. And they've got some pretty unique practices, too. They use poison darts for hunting.
Yeah, they get the poison from the desert rose. It takes 3 hours to boil it down to the right strength. And it works on most animals, except for elephants, apparently. They also know how to handle the poisoned meat so they don't get sick.
It's pretty amazing, this traditional knowledge that they have. But sadly, even these communities are facing problems. Our sources say that their land is shrinking, and more people are being drawn to wage labor.
Yeah, it's a real issue for a lot of hunter-gatherer groups. They're losing their land and their way of life. It's really becoming a human rights problem.
So we can't just copy the Hadza, but we can learn from their values, like a respect for nature and how they live sustainably. Now let's talk about some traditional diets that you might be more familiar with, like the Inuit and the Maasai.
Yeah, and when you look at these groups, you see the limits of like the food pyramid, the one that puts grains at the bottom. Well, for people like the Inuit who traditionally ate mostly meat and fat, that just doesn't make sense.
In the Maasai too, right. They're all about their cattle.
Exactly. And both of these groups are going through something called the nutrition transition, which basically means they're eating more and more processed foods.
And that can have some weird effects. Like studies show a lot of Inuit people are now getting their vitamin C from things like fruit drinks and potato chips.
Yeah.
Even though they traditionally got it from, hunting and sharing country foods.
Yeah, it's wild how quickly these changes can happen and how processed foods can kind of sneak in, even in places with really strong traditions.
And while studies show that traditional Inuit diets were healthier, they weren't like drastically different, which suggests that lifestyle is really important too.
Right, and there's evidence that the transition period itself can be the worst for your health. Like people who are in the middle of switching from a traditional diet to a more Western one, they tend to have more problems than people who are fully on one or the other.
It's like their bodies aren't used to it yet or something. Our sources talk about this difference between knowledge that and know-how.
Yeah, knowledge that is like facts, and know-how is about skills. And a lot of traditional communities have incredible know-how when it comes to food, even if they don't know the science behind it.
Right. Like they know how to hunt and gather and eat sustainably.
Yeah.
Even if they can't explain it in terms of vitamins and minerals.
Exactly. And scientists are actually starting to figure out the science behind a lot of these traditional practices. So there's real wisdom there, even if it's not always expressed in scientific terms.
And these traditional societies can also challenge our ideas about, ethics. Like the Maasai and their cattle. It's a really deep connection.
Yeah, they share names with their cattle, and they even call themselves Inkishu, which is their word for cattle. They have a prayer too. Mayukh. It means peace to our cattle.
That's pretty amazing. But they also hunt lions, which can seem kind of wrong from a conservation standpoint.
It is complicated. Sometimes they hunt lions to protect their livestock, but it's also a rite of passage for young warriors, so it has a cultural significance too.
Okay, so let's move on from traditional diets and talk about the agricultural revolution. We often think of it as this big step forward for humanity, but our sources suggest it's not that simple.
Right. It's not just a straightforward story of progress.
Yeah.
Agriculture allowed for bigger populations and cities and stuff, but some argue that it also led to health problems and inequality.
Like in hunter-gatherer societies, they didn't have a lot of stuff to store. So there wasn't much opportunity for some people to become super rich and powerful. But with farming, some people could control more land and resources, and eventually you had landowners who didn't even have to farm themselves.
And there's evidence that early farmers were actually less healthy than hunter-gatherers. They had more problems with things like iron deficiency.
But to be fair, those problems did get better over time as agriculture developed. And anthropologist Elissa Crittenden reminds us that it wasn't just a story of decline. Like some research suggests that some early farmers actually had pretty soft diets.
Yeah. Jim Watson looked at dental wear patterns. And some farming communities didn't have the kind of wear and tear you'd expect from a tough diet. So it's a mixed bag, really. The agricultural revolution. It had its benefits, but also its downsides.
Okay, so let's fast forward to today and talk about smallholder farmers. A lot of people have this romantic idea of them, like they're saving the world with their sustainable practices. And you hear that statistic all the time. They produce 80% of the world's food. But is that really true?
Well, it's kind of misleading. It's true that about 80% of food comes from family farms, but a lot of those are actually pretty big. Smallholders, the ones with very little land, produce less than a third of the world's food.
And it's not like all smallholder farmers are living great lives either. Take Bhutan, for example. They rely heavily on small farms. But they also have a lot of poverty and health issues.
Yeah, it's kind of crazy. They have what's called a triple burden of malnutrition. They have high rates of stunting and micronutrient deficiencies.
Yeah.
But they also have rising obesity. It's like they're dealing with too little food and too much food at the same time.
And Bhutanese farmers face a lot of challenges. Labor shortages, difficult terrain. And they have this system called FEW, where workers are paid in goods instead of money.
But despite all that, there are also signs of hope. Like new community organizations and online networks are helping farmers connect and support each other. And some people believe that Bhutan can actually use technology to improve their agriculture without repeating the mistakes of other countries.
And there's potential for agritourism, too. But overall, it seems like smallholder farming, while important, isn't a perfect solution. It can be really tough, and a lot of people leave if they can't. So let's shift gears now and talk about a country that completely transformed its food system. The Netherlands.
Talk about a turnaround. They went from a terrible famine to being one of the biggest food exporters in the world.
And it all started with the Dutch hunger winter back in 1944 and 45. It was brutal. People were starving. And it actually had long-term effects on their health. Even their descendants were affected.
Yeah, it's called epigenetics. Basically, the famine changed how their genes worked, and that got passed down to their kids.
Wow. So this experience really shaped the Dutch. They became obsessed with producing as much food as possible, and they embraced new farming methods, especially after the war.
Yeah, they were big on the Green Revolution, with synthetic fertilizers and stuff.
Wow.
Their Minister of Agriculture, Sicko Mansholt, was a huge proponent of it. And it worked. They boosted their food production like crazy.
But it came at a cost, right? The environment took a hit. And even Mansholt later said he regretted the use of pesticides and the loss of biodiversity.
Yeah. And now the Dutch government is trying to cut back on emissions and livestock, which has led to a lot of pushback from farmers. There's this new political party, the Farmer Citizen Movement, or BBB. They're really popular.
It just shows how hard it is to change a food system, especially when people's livelihoods are at stake. But this idea of making agriculture more sustainable is really important. And it brings us to the concept of sustainable intensification.
Right. Sustainable intensification is about getting more food from less, basically using fewer resources. Especially land. And there's a big debate about how to do that. There's land sparing and land sharing.
So what's the difference?
Land sparing is about farming a smaller area but doing it really intensively. So you get high yields from that land. And then you leave the rest of the land alone for nature. Land sharing is more about integrating farming with nature, making farms more wildlife friendly.
Interesting. And where does organic farming fit in?
Well, organic farming tends to align with land sharing. But it also tends to be less productive. Like, studies show that organic farms produce about 75 to 80% of what conventional farms do. And that has some people worried. Like, if we switch to mostly organic, we might not have enough food.
Right, especially with a growing population. And what about conservation agriculture?
Well, conservation agriculture is all about protecting the soil, like no-till farming. And it's cool because it seems to appeal to people across the spectrum. Even Prince Charles, who's a big organic advocate, is a fan of no-till.
So there's no easy answer here.
Yeah.
No one-size-fits-all solution. It's all about finding the right approach for each situation.
Yeah, exactly. And that diversity is actually really important.
Yeah.
Just like biodiversity is good for ecosystems, dietary diversity is good for us. And it's interesting how the Inuit manage to have a diverse diet, even though they eat mostly meat. They include small amounts of different plants, too.
So diversity is key, both in what we eat and in how we farm. Let's talk about something we all enjoy, chocolate. But behind that delicious treat is a really complex and often unfair system.
Yeah, chocolate is a great example of how globalized our food system is. You've got these huge companies like Callebaut, Cargill, Mondelez, Olin Blummer. They make tons of money, but they don't actually grow the cacao beans or make the chocolate bars.
And the process of turning cacao into chocolate is pretty amazing. There's harvesting, fermenting, drying, roasting, winnowing, grinding, conching, tempering. It's a lot of steps.
Yeah, and good chocolate can have just as many flavor compounds as coffee or wine. It's really sophisticated. And it's kind of funny how the industry often overlooks the work that farmers do, like the fermenting and drying. That's crucial for the flavor, but they don't always consider it processing.
And there are also environmental problems with cacao production. Deforestation, loss of biodiversity. It's like we're seeing with so many other crops. Like bananas. Remember how the Gros Michel banana was wiped out by disease? And now we mostly eat the Cavendish.
Yeah, and that's because the Cavendish is more resistant to disease and easier to ship. It doesn't taste as good. It's like we're prioritizing convenience over quality.
And the cacao market is really tough for farmers. They're at the mercy of global prices. And even fair trade labels don't always guarantee them a good living.
Right. And there are alternatives like direct trade and farmer cooperatives, but they're still pretty small. And then there's the issue of child labor. Despite all the promises, it's still a big problem in West Africa.
It's like no matter how much we love chocolate, there's this dark side to it. And it raises a bigger question about exploitation in the food system.
Yeah, it's not just about chocolate. It goes back centuries, like slavery in Mesopotamia and the slave trade in East Africa. People were forced to grow crops like cloves.
And it's still happening today. Like even in the UK, there are cases of modern slavery in agriculture. People working for almost nothing in terrible conditions. It's crazy to think that Côte d'Ivoire and Ghana became major cacao producers because of slavery in São Tomé and Príncipe.
Yeah, buyers were looking for a new source of cacao, and that's how those countries became dominant. It's like exploitation is built into the system.
It's depressing, but it's important to talk about. And it makes you wonder, do we have a moral obligation to make things better?
Well, our sources argue that we do. Like Adam Smith talked about fellow feeling, and David Hume believed in altruism. Basically, we should care about other people, even if they're far away and producing our food.
And some people worry that if we end exploitation, jobs will be lost. But maybe you would actually free people up to do other things, like processing food closer to where it's grown, adding value, like coffee roasting in coffee-producing countries.
Yeah, that's an interesting idea. But the big challenge is cost. If we pay people fairly, food prices might go up. And that's a hard sell politically.
And these global supply chains are so complex, it's really hard to know what's happening at every stage. Like Louise Nichols visited a cocoa farm and was shocked by what she saw. It was so different from what she'd been told.
It shows how much power the food industry has and how they can control the narrative. They use marketing to influence what we buy, even targeting kids. And they encourage us to eat more than we need.
And while some companies are trying to be more sustainable, there's always this pressure to make profits for shareholders. And that limits what they can do.
And that's why some people say we need more regulation, to create a level playing field. So companies that exploit people and the environment don't have an advantage.
Yeah. And we can't forget about the role of governments. Food policy has shaped history. Like the Bengal famine was caused by government policies. And during the Irish potato famine, Ireland was still exporting grain.
It's crazy, right? And trade agreements can also have a huge impact, like when the U.S. challenged the EU's ban on GMOs.
Yeah, it's all connected. But there are some countries that are doing things differently. Like Finland has a really strong national food policy. They're focused on food security.
And New Zealand is another interesting case. They deregulated their farming industry and became a major exporter, but now they're facing environmental problems.
Always a balancing act. And there's this movement towards local food governance, giving people more control over their food systems, like through things like food policy councils.
And it's important to remember that food cultures are always changing. Like British mincemeat doesn't even have meat in it anymore. And a lot of what we think of as traditional Italian food is actually pretty recent.
It's kind of like how fish and chips became a British staple, or paprika became a symbol of Hungary, or how Japanese cuisine changed after World War II.
Yeah, food is a reflection of culture. But culture is always evolving. And it's interesting how food can be both unifying and divisive. Like the Maasai traditionally look down on hunter-gatherers.
So it can bring people together, but also create hierarchies. Now let's talk about the food sovereignty movement.
Yeah, it's a really important movement, especially for small farmers. It's about giving people control over their own food systems, the right to healthy and culturally appropriate food, and the right to decide how it's produced.
And it's had a real impact. Like the FAO has incorporated some of its ideas into its policies. And it's not just about farmers either. It's about everyone having access to good food.
Right. And food is about so much more than just fuel. It's part of our identity, our culture. Even in emergencies like refugee camps, food plays a huge social role.
Like in the Kutupalong camp in Bangladesh.
Yeah.
The way food is distributed and shared is really important. And the food industry is catching on to this. They're trying to appeal to our values, not just our taste buds.
Yeah, they're talking about sustainability and social impact and all that, but some people are skeptical. They think it's just marketing.
So where does all this leave us? Well, it seems like our food system is pretty messed up. It's driven by profit and power, and it's not really fair.
Yeah, and our sources argue that we need a new approach, one that's based on fairness. We need to shift power away from big corporations and towards people, and maybe one way to do that is to focus more on real food. Whole nutritious food. Not just processed junk.
And we need to value food for what it is, not just calories, but culture and identity and all that.
Yeah.
And that means understanding different food cultures and respecting them.
Yeah, we need to move beyond this idea of one right way to eat or farm. And putting people at the heart of the food system, that shouldn't be a radical idea. It should be common sense.
So this deep dive has shown us just how complex and interconnected our food system is. And raises a lot of questions, like what can we do to make it better, more sustainable, more just?
It's a big challenge, but we all have a role to play.
So for you listening out there, what do you think is the most important thing to change? And what's one small thing you could do differently? It's something to think about. Food for thought, you could say.
I like that. Food for thought.
Yeah.
Because it's not just about what we eat. It's about how we think about food and how we can create a better system for everyone.
Thanks for listening, everybody.
See you next time.
And don't forget to subscribe to Revise and Resubmit on Spotify and Apple Podcasts for more captivating deep dives like this one. And if you're enjoying the show and want to support us in creating more insightful content, consider becoming a patron on Patreon. Every contribution helps us continue this journey of exploration and discovery. Until next time, keep those minds curious, keep questioning, and keep revising and resubmitting.